It really was one of the worst times in our history. I mean, to the point where people were actually diving out of windows of skyscrapers because they lost. Hey guys and gals, it's your buddies Drew and Ralphie with Living History's Mysteries and Ferocious Feline Productions. You know, a lot of times when we're looking into the past and we're trying to find that really awesome subject matter to discuss here on the channel, we are lucky enough to find actual voices from history. Be it documented, written word, or the actual voices of the people who went through it. Today's no different. Today we are going to take a look at the Great Depression of the early mid 20th century. The Voices of America. Check this out. This is good.
As it hasn't gone. We'll find and we'll prosper. So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
As Franklin D. Roosevelt spoke these simple and inspiring words in 1933, Americans from coast to coast, weary from years of economic hardship, were willing to take the freshly minted president at his word. He offered them hope, which was all that many people had left. The economic hardships brought on by the Great Depression had reached a pinnacle by the spring of 1933. On March 4th, an unprecedented event had occurred. Each and every bank had closed its doors. For some, this measure was only temporary, but for a large number, the economic crisis was a permanent reality. The banking system was near collapse. A quarter of the labor force was unemployed, and prices and production were down by a third from their 1929 levels. During his first inaugural speech, President Roosevelt looked over the tense crowd in front of the Capitol, anxiously gathered before him, and with unquestionable conviction stated, "This nation asks for action, and action now."
My father was a cotton mill worker, and so we moved a lot. By the time I was 21 years old, I had moved 21 times. But we didn't have a big house back then, and you didn't have carpet or anything like that. You had linoleum floor, wooden floors with linoleum rugs down on top of it to keep the air out, because some of the places we lived, you could see the ground through the floor. We ran a country grocery store. We ran a grist mill and a cotton gin. In the South, cotton was the king, and you couldn't get anything for the cotton. And then the government came along and had us take and cut out cotton production.
Back in the Depression, we saw a lot of people come from southeast Kentucky and eastern Tennessee because they wanted to get better jobs. There was nothing going in the coal mines. So we had a lot of people come in that were in bad shape. And they also went across the river to Cincinnati, and there were almost little enclaves of those people, hoping that they'd get
do a job, to get employment, to keep the family going.
In the first 100 days of the new administration, 15 measures flowed from the White House to Congress. 15 new laws assured absolute government action to employ the jobless, to improve the Tennessee Valley, to support crop prices, to prevent home foreclosures, to ensure bank deposits, and to stabilize the economy. Franklin D. Roosevelt called these programs a New Deal for the nation.
My mother got a job with the WPA, one of the New Deal agencies. She worked in the public library, and I think she really enjoyed that job. She talked about it a lot, and it's the only job that she ever had in her entire life. Later on, after she married, she did not work outside the home, but she talked a lot. When she would take us to the library as small children, she would tell us about her experiences working for the WPA in the public library.
During the Depression, many people from Oklahoma and other states affected by the Dust Bowl moved to San Joaquin Valley looking for work. Some families were lucky and were able to get good jobs in Tehachapi, working in the cement plant and the women's state prison. My parents bought a house on the edge of town, and we had no gas or sewer line. I can still remember when the gas line was laid through the alley, the workers wrapping a material that looked like saran wrap around the pipes. The house next door was rented mostly by families from Oklahoma. One family built a small square shack behind the house using rolls of roofing material to cover the outside walls, and migrant families would live in the shack for a while before moving somewhere else looking for work. Our house was close to the railroad tracks, and I remember men knocking on our back door asking for water and something to eat. My mom would make them a bologna sandwich and white bread. Back then, these men were not called homeless people, but were called hobos or tramps that rode the trains.
A lot of people remember what things cost, but they don't remember what they made, and that makes a whole lot of difference. You know, you can buy a Coke for a nickel or a hamburger for a nickel, but the trouble was you didn't have a nickel to buy them with mostly, and just things like that. So, you know, your memory clouds things a little bit, and you tend to remember the good things.
My husband, when he was a small boy, he was brought up in Walker County, Alabama. It is a coal mining district, and he was paid 10 cents a shot to go into the coal mines and to light the fuse on the blasting powder and then run like blazes to get out before the thing exploded. Men wouldn't do it, grown men wouldn't do it because they couldn't move fast enough. So they hired him because he was small and wiry, and he would get out of there before it blew up. Well, when his father found out about it, he whooped the tar out of him.
The president's first priority was relief for the millions of Americans who suddenly found themselves without work, without food, without shelter, and without hope. He concluded that help for the downtrodden must come from beyond the traditional private or local government sources. He believed that the federal government needed to take on a larger role in providing for the well-being of the American people. Of his many initiatives, the Works Progress Administration was the largest. It was created in the spring of 1935, and it further extended the national relief effort. The primary goal of the WPA was to alleviate the high unemployment rate and to provide assistance for the discouraged American workforce.
The benefits from working for the WPA was that he was given fabric, and my mother has told me several times of a story of where they got the fabric, and it seems that the fabric was all one color and one design. So everybody knew if you had that fabric that it was a WPA type part of their job, part of their pay. My grandmother made dresses for all the girls, and my mother was real excited because that meant she had two dresses. And in this day and time, we don't think of that many, but she was very excited about wearing her new dress to school. But when she got there, the other girls who had a little bit more money kind of laughed at her because she had on WPA. But I laughed at her statement. She said, "I didn't care. I had another
seamstress, and she worked all of her life, all of her married life, and she would send this aunt out to collect remnants from clothing factories. And so clothes was not a problem. It was not an issue because my grandmother could make something out of nothing, always. She said, however, shoes, they didn't have shoes because Grandma couldn't make shoes. One of my aunts, who was 85, shared so many stories with me. She said that she didn't feel that the Depression had made that much of an impact on them because they were a family of 9 children. So life was just always a struggle. And she didn't really notice that much because everybody in the neighborhood and all the other family members were working just as hard and struggling just as hard.
One of the stories that my mother tells is that the rolling truck would come to their farm once a week, and if they had worked hard for their family that week, they got 1 egg. Each child, there was 12 children, they got 1 egg, and when the truck came, they could trade that egg for a piece of candy. And my mother tells to this day how good that candy tasted because that was the only candy they got for another whole week.
When we were little, we had to go out near the dump and play ball. You know, use rocks and stones for bases.
My brother and I, one of the things that we loved to do all the time in the summertime was to go and pick blackberries. Blackberries are plentiful and they're free. They grow wild in the woods, and we would always come home and I would help her make a pie, blackberry pie, and we loved it. And she would always tell me that we were using her mother's recipe. And blackberry pie is a very simple dish to make. It doesn't cost very much if the blackberries are free. It's just a little sugar and then a little crust made with flour and lard. And she would tell me that there were times during the Depression when blackberry pie is all that they had to eat.
We were raised in the Sunset District of San Francisco. My dad had an office job, and like so many people in the prosperous 1920s, he was doing well. Then the Great Depression hit. My dad lost his job in 1930. His savings were depleted. We were forced to accept charity. The term welfare was not in vogue at the time. The procedure was once a week the Associated Charities of San Francisco would deliver boxes of food to needy families. We would watch as the boxes were brought to the men. At first, 1 or 2 families were getting aid, but as the Depression deepened, most of the families were receiving assistance. It was sad to see men selling apples on the street corners. Their clothes were old and shabby and usually consisted of a pair of old pants with a suit coat, trying to stay warm on a typical foggy day. We lost our house, a cottage at 1933 8th Avenue, which still stands and is presently occupied. Edward McSweeney, June 1994.
My grandfather used to talk a whole lot about the Depression, and he often stated that during the Depression that money was real tight. And I remember a story he told me about his oldest son. He said, if you do it right, living on the farm, you could always eat. And he said he didn't have to stand in the soup line, anything like that, because he was able to raise his own food. And also, he had plenty of cows and chickens and hogs for food. So he wasn't hungry, but some of the other things like clothing, his family didn't have many clothes or anything like that. They didn't have much money to buy them. And he stated that his son was barefooted and he wanted him to go to school, and he didn't have shoes. And he found a nickel, and with that nickel, he went and bought his son a pair of shoes. My grandmother, she stated that she was mad at President Hoover at the time, and she felt at that particular time that the work she had to do wasn't much better than the work that her grandparents had to do, and they were slaves, and she said that wasn't much better than slave labor.
My maternal grandmother was born in Maine in 1920. In the summer of 1929, when she was 9 years old, her parents decided to move to Michigan because some other family members had found work there. They had a substantial amount of money in the bank when the stock market crashed in October of 1929. The banks closed and they had no access to their funds. Over time, they both lost their jobs. They struggled for a couple of years in Michigan. In fact, they lived near a state prison, and my great-uncle told me that he remembered people talking about breaking into the prison because the prisoners were able to get a lot of fresh foods from the gardens that they grew. After struggling for a couple of years in Michigan, my great-grandparents received a letter from a relative in Maine who said that he could provide a job for my great-grandfather in the logging industry. The relative who offered this job wrote to the state officials on behalf of my great-grandfather, and the state agreed to provide him with $25 and a Model T Ford to travel back to Maine with. It was a journey of mishaps. The Model T Ford that they were given had no fuel pump like modern cars. The gas was gravity-fed into the engine, so that the car had to go up steep hills in reverse. And in fact, the car was so slow at times that the family would just get out and walk beside it. But they eventually made it back to the Maine woods, where my great-grandfather worked as a logger for a while, near the town of Andover. I know that during that time, loggers who worked hard could make about $1 a day cutting cordwood. They used buck saws and axes and hauled the trees out of the woods using horses. And if they were lucky, they could cut 4 to 6 cord of wood a day.
The 1930s was a decade of tremendous technological advancement, and by 1939, over 80% of Americans had a radio set. Although primarily used for entertainment, radio broadcasts quickly became a tool to inform the public of the increasing crisis in Europe. Roosevelt steered a steady course and kept the American audience informed about his plans and progress through a series of radio addresses which came to be called fireside chats. These broadcasts were centered on specific topics and issues and were delivered in a warm and simple language that made people feel they were partners in the efforts the president was putting forth. When Franklin Roosevelt, poised and self-assured, addressed his audience as "my friends," most Americans believed they were exactly that.
My grandfather had a store, a little country store, and he sold food, but also some other types of items too. And he was very successful with his business until the Depression came along, and he had extended credit to a lot of people, and of course people were out of work and they were not able to pay, and if they didn't pay him, then he couldn't afford to operate the store, so he lost his business. And the family struggled for a long time after that because there were no jobs. It took a long time for him to find work, particularly in that part of the country.
My grandfather was a grocer, always had been a grocer, and that I noticed in the city directories that they were always moving, and she said that was because he was always looking for a better location, a better neighborhood where business would be better and they might be able to improve their finances. But he eventually went out of business after 25 years of being a grocer. His ruin had been his compassion for the poor people. He gave credit and they couldn't pay him back.
They didn't know that they were poor as such because they had food, they had a place to live. She knew she didn't have a lot of things, but she did know that she, had the basic things that she needed, and a big family, and they all took care of each other.
My mom was born in 1918. My dad was born in 1920. Both have passed away in the last 18 months or so. What I remember most about them, they were great parents, great providers, and they were great teachers to all the McSweeney children. As a kid growing up, I remember them speaking not about the hard times during the 1930s. They spoke rather about Roosevelt's hope and the optimism, and they would tell us stories over and over again about old-time radio, Jack Armstrong, the All-American Boy, Jack Benny, Amos and Andy. They would talk about all the famous sports teams, the Gas House Gang in baseball, the New York Yankees. They told us about how they would go to Just a tremendous period to be a young child growing up. And I guess as testimony to their own parents, they kept that side of the Great Depression in terms of the negative image away from us.
We were aware to a degree, but most of our friends were in the same boat we were. So we didn't know much about the discrepancy. We'd see the big houses, you know, the people had big homes and things like that, but we never came in contact with them much or talked to them much. So we just knew they had a lot more than we had, but there was no hope out there. We never really desired to be rich because we knew it was hopeless.
When I met President Roosevelt in 1935, I don't remember too much about the dinner, but I saw him standing at the door. He was shaking hands with all the patients that were coming to dinner that day, and he asked me my name. He said, "Little girl, what is your name?" And I told him Suzanne. I love the name Suzanne, but I'd like to call you Susie. Is that all right? And I said, and guess what we called him? Rosie. And the older children called him Doc Roosevelt.
We have a late bulletin. Here is a flash. President Roosevelt passed away this afternoon at Warm Springs, Georgia. This afternoon at his little white pine cottage atop the Pine Mountain. Franklin D. Roosevelt in his 63rd year at his home in Warm Springs, Georgia, was affectionately called the Little White House. They said it beyond a doubt it was cerebral hemorrhage. The Allied world is pouring out its sympathy. The president's death came without warning. He had been in 4:35 p.m. Eastern Wartime. The president died without pain. And at 5:45 p.m. Eastern Wartime in Washington, former press secretary Stephen Early announced the earth-shaking news.
He was sad when he got back from Yalta. He thought, well, if I can get down to one Springs, I can get my dream back. And he looked bad. He was 63 years old. And but he had been, he looked like he was tired. And but he would always smile when you would see him.
When the news came on April 12, 1945, that President Roosevelt had died, all Americans felt the severity of this loss. Millions mourned over the death of a man that most had never met. President Roosevelt died, confidently believing that victory was assured, but never able to fully realize the success of all that he had accomplished.
Welcome back. You know, it's like I said in the beginning. Seldom, so very seldom, are we lucky enough to actually catch those voices, those real echoes from history. Granted, a lot of the people that told their family stories in this video were just small children back then. But man, what stories they have to tell. I was telling Ralphie when you guys came in, the Depression got so bad and happened so quickly that people who were millionaires on a Tuesday were paupers on a Wednesday, and a lot of them didn't know how to react. They actually dove out of windows of office buildings and skyscrapers because they didn't know how to not be rich. What is adversity? How do we handle certain situations? I guess it all depends on the individual. Maybe, just maybe, if you come from nothing and become something, you're more equipped at returning to nothing, because you know either way, though more challenging, you're still going to survive. But that's all we got for you guys today. Thank you for coming, joining us, and checking out the Great Depression, the voice of America. Pretty interesting. And there's a hell of a story to be told. But until next time, y'all take care of yourselves. Take care of each other. God bless you. God love you. We do. And we'll see you out there.